Hello everyone, my name is Tyler Eitree, and this is my presentation for my final paper in anthropology here. So, to start off, let's talk about Alaska, the last frontier. Also, the region in which we've been discussing the many native tribes throughout the state. Some of which are some that I list in my final paper are the Eskimo. I don't go into a depth conclusion as to which Eskimo. I just state Eskimo. And Athabascan, and then the Tlingit and Haida. So, let's start. In Steve Langdon's book, he describes many of the Alaskan Native tribes, which is also a source that I have in my final paper. He talks about the Eskimo and where they were located, which is mainly the northwest area of Alaska, mostly along the coast. They did a lot of whaling and such. And in my paper, I describe basically what it was, their connection to their land. So let's say the Yupik, they hunted a lot of seal, they hunted whale, and occasionally they had the opportunity to hunt larger game such as moose and caribou. So that affected their culture, also affected their lifestyle. So like what kind of clothes they wore. They wore sealskin coats and such, and that helped them adapt to their land and how they hunted and how they lived. See, the coastal windy climate that was a bit cold, their sealskin jackets were able to keep them warm and dry. And you move to the map here, you can see some of the area. This is a map I found online of, as you can see, the Yupik inhabit the blue and yellowish regions on the map there. Also, there was other Eskimo tribes that were listed in his book that lived in the blue region there. So next I'll move on to the Athabascan. The Athabascan, of course, inhabit the purple area as labeled, and they were the interior region, kind of Indians, Native Americans, and they had more of a very larger diet, let's just say that. They had caribou, of course, moose, they had birds, they ate fish, they had a very large diet. And that, of course, varied according to where they were in that interior region. So, I mean, the northern area of the interior, those people would eat different things or hunt different animals than the people of the southern area or right in the middle. So, and as that, they had different cultures, and they had different kinds of clothes they wore that represented where they lived on the map and what they hunted, their connection to the land and such. So I mean, the Athabascan they had some of the finest clothes to be found around most native tribes throughout Alaska. Their clothes were well tailored to fit the wearer, and they lasted long as well. The clothing was usually made of caribou skin, and due to the Athabascans' women's ability to make good clothing, it held substantial value in trade. So that ties into their culture, where they live, and their way of life and such, which is what I'm getting to in my main point here. The last one I'm going to talk about is the Haida and Tlingit, which you can see are located in the green area down there on the panhandle. So the Tlingit and Haida were southeast coastal tribes that were heavily reliant upon the coast for most of their food. They were well known for their constructing of elaborate devices and plans for catching salmon and other kinds of fish that made up most of their diet. Their clothing was not particularly decorative, and it did not completely resemble the tribe's main ways of life. They wore caribou and deer loincloths, that was described as their clothes that they wore in the book, and they were more of a fishing kind of a group of people. They had a lot of fish in their diet and such, and that again ties into their culture and the way of life, and it defines who they are. So, through this summary of the certain native groups associated with Alaska, it is clear that the subsistence lifestyle of the natives of Alaska is very close connected to who they are. It is a part of their culture and activities associated with what they used to be, and it can help them remember who and what they used to be as native groups. So it helps them remember who they are, that is who they are. So, westernization. Westernization is both good and bad for Alaskan Native Americans. On one hand, it gives people cheaper and easier ways to find food than they would be able to regularly get, so they can just go to the store and buy stuff. That obviously isn't true in a village, but there are easier ways of getting food than going out and shooting something. So there's that. But then again, it can tie in that kind of it affects who they are as we move on to the next slide. In the article, The Cooler Ring, which was one of the assigned readings in this class, it tells us that the Native Americans are connected to one another and the land through the food it provides to them. Now, in this reading, we read about a woman who is, of course, Alaskan Native, and she carries around a red cooler. Her name was Flora Mark, and the author who accompanied her trip basically describes what she did throughout her travels, as she went to different villages and traded donuts essentially for different kinds of native foods such as caribou meat, berries, and some other forms of foods. And she proceeded to carry around a red and white cooler as shown below that is described as hauling around 100 pounds of shin barking weight. And I've carried around a cooler like that before. It is not easy. It also stated, and this is a quote, "The red and white cooler is a reminder of the ties that bind these women to the land. It symbolizes their way of life and their culture. You know, back then that was they bartered for things, such as bartering donuts for caribou meat. And so this kind of ties this kind of shows how these natives are tied to one another and the land by trading and their connection to one another through subsistence and bartering like that. So this article was particularly good at illustrating the idea that the food of the natives of Alaska is what keeps them together through the changes and what they experience in their personal lives and the world around them. It keeps them together. It reminds them of who they are, you know. So, moving on from the cooler ring, another article that I included in my paper was Food in the Making of Modern Inuit Identities. This was another reading that was assigned. And it basically hits on the idea that non-traditional foods are potentially replacing other kinds of traditional foods. As you can see, the Doritos, M&Ms, soda, snack foods, they're on the left versus that delicious pile of salmon there on the right. You know, there's non-traditional foods that are easier to get, and then there's traditional foods that aren't as easy to get. This article also hits on something I'm going to talk about later on, which is some of the chemicals that are found in Alaska's waters. But the main point of this isn't a major concern as to the non-traditional foods in affecting how much that Native American or Alaskan natives eat their traditional foods, but it's more or less moving on to the fact that they are more or less concerned with the quality of the traditional foods. So they are more or less moving back to non-traditional. They are moving to non-traditional foods a little bit more because of the toxins and different kinds of harmful materials that could be in the Alaska waters, surrounding the state. So basically, in that, we move on to the toxins in Alaska's water that could be affecting Native Alaskan traditional diets. Example of this is the disaster that released numerous amounts of harmful chemicals into Alaska waters, which was, Exxon Valdez. There's a large amount of oil that spilled into the water, and as you can see down the picture below, I believe that's a whale, and you can see all the oil on the rocks there on the shore. And that's just one example. In another article that we read in class, that was assigned to read in class, there was a kind of neurotoxin that had been found in the water surrounding and possibly inside of Alaska. I believe it's pronounced methylmercury. It's a serious neurotoxin that has been known to the scientific community for over 25 years, and as of 2007, it was found in fish located in Alaska. Now, this is a potent neurotoxin. Its exposure in fetuses and children can lead to irreversible neurological and developmental disorders. And it also has the ability to adversely affect the nervous, cardiovascular, and immune systems. Now, due to the high levels of this neurotoxin found in fish around and in Alaska, the Division of Public Health issued its first fish consumption advisory, potentially limiting the exposure of this neurotoxin to people that consume the marine animal. And as we know, Native Americans, uh, like Alaska natives, they consume a lot of fish, a lot of salmon, a lot of other fish also. And that's a big deal to them. They consume a lot of that because it's a subsistence lifestyle they live, or at least most of them, and that is what they eat. It's their traditional food. You can't stop them from having that, and they of course argued and fought for their right to their traditional food. So they believe that they should be able to have that, and I do too, of course. But potentially dangerous neurotoxins is one reason why the traditional foods have been a little bit less consumed, or is concern for natives to turn to non-traditional foods, which is not a good thing. As we read about in the Cooler Ring, that subsistence lifestyle and that connection to the land that defines Native Americans, that defines Alaskan natives, tells them who they are. That's it's kind of like a flashback in a sense. It helps them define themselves. So, in conclusion, Alaskan natives are connected to the land and its fate. So, they're connected to one another through the land. They're connected to nature. They believe that and respect nature and its animals. They don't believe they're superior to the food chain or really the animals that provide them with food. They more or less respect that and one another. So that's basically the conclusion of my final paper, and more or less that's the summary of the whole thing. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I appreciate you listening. Thanks.